doing the same thing on my laptop just because I didn't set it up here. But I'll just start off by saying thank you to all of you for coming. One of the great things about teaching at college, particularly as a linguist, is that we have students, faculty, and staff from all over New York City and all over the world speaking many different languages as well as different dialects of English. And this panel, while it deals with language and identity, place is also an important concept because of how closely it connects to language, identity, and belonging. And with regard to place, that's another great thing about college. Its location. It's centered, or situated, should I say, at a nexus of Caribbean cultures and other cultures. And I'm teaching a course this semester called Pidgin and Creole Languages in the Caribbean and beyond. And one of the projects that students in this course are working on right now is an ethnographic community research project. And one of the things they have to do, this project invites them to engage with the local communities around Brooklyn College, but also throughout New York City, using them as sites of knowledge. And so for those of you online who are in my Pidgin and Creole Languages course, I want you to see today's session as additional content, or let it serve as inspiration for your exploration of the role of language and identity in the local communities that you will be examining for this assignment, which is due next week, as you know. So to my wonderful students on the panel with me, I really want to thank you for the labor that you put into engaging the theme of language and identity, bringing this topic into conversation, your own research interests, as well as your lived experiences, and helping also to illuminate a range of new ways of thinking about the role of language and identity construction. And so with this panel, what I would like to do, I'm going to first give some definitions. I'll make a few remarks, but then I'll turn it over to my students to introduce themselves and share their work with you. And as part of, I guess, I see this as kind of a part of the interconnectedness of our lives. So I invite you in the room to not just passively listen. I want you to engage. I want you to think with us. I want you to engage with us. And so there will be a point when I will be throwing out some questions. Those of you online will also want to participate. But I really want you to kind of see this as interactive as well. So I'm going to start with these definitions, just to give you a sense of where I'm situated disciplinary-wise and research-wise. So I'm a linguist. I'm in the English department at the Linguistics program. And linguistics is the scientific study of human language. And I also am a sociolinguist, which deals with the relationship between language and society. I'm also an applied linguist. And applied linguistics investigates the development and the use of language in real-world situations or contexts. And the goal of it is to try to improve language or communication-related problems that involve, so it really wants to improve the way we interact and communicate with each other. It wants to improve policy. Please come in. So it tries to solve problems related to language and communication. And while both sociolinguistics and applied linguistics are concerned with how people use language to construct and negotiate identities, for sociolinguistics it's more of a central concern if you were to compare with applied linguistics. So I'm going to now do my brief introduction, and after this, you won't hear from me until later. Turn it over to my students. So language is, for a linguist, it's essential. It's an essential aspect of our identity as humans, and it plays a defining role in the way that we construct, perform, and negotiate our individual and group identities. Language is the primary medium through which we articulate our struggles and our triumphs, and it's the medium through which we transmit any of our memories, histories, and lived experiences to others. Language can serve as a lifeline in the spaces where one's identity, dignity, and humanity are at stake. And during this panel, we invite you to reflect on the role of language in your class. So I'll ask now my students to come up. I thought we were going to be able to sit panel style. I don't know if we can. Is that possible? Okay, so, and I can adjust the slides.
Okay. Hello. I'm just making sure that you guys can hear me because sometimes my voice is a bit tricky. So I guess I'll go first. My name is Tracy Cunningham. I'm a senior at Brooklyn College. This is my last semester. I'm a linguistics major and philosophy minor. In speaking on the topic of applied linguistics, I thought what would be interesting is just to kind of speak on my experience with languages as it concerns my work experience. I'm not your typical student. I've returned to college after pursuing a career as a talent manager previous to this, and now I'm working in the social services field. So I just kind of want to touch on two unique jobs that I've had previously. The first one was when I used to work as a talent manager specifically for like models and actors in New York City. The second is when I was working as a casting director and consultant in Shanghai, China. And just how language kind of worked with that before I really give you more details on my social services job, which kind of ties in more with some research that I've been working on with Professor Moody here at Brooklyn College. So just to give you an idea about a talent manager, basically what we do is we just kind of speak with clients and kind of negotiate on behalf of different talents that we represent. At that time I was working with a lot of models, so what that would look like is that I was in new faces and scouting. So a lot of my job was with international clients because we were looking for new talent to bring to America to work with high-end clients. A lot of the times these models were younger, especially when I started doing it, which was like almost 20 years ago. And because of that, a lot of them didn't speak English. So I know a lot of you are familiar with like Brazilian supermodels and Russian supermodels who typically came from demographics that were of the poorer variety, because a lot of cultures other than in America, they look down on modeling as it's seen as more adjacent to kind of like prostitution. So I bring that up as it applies to the sociolinguistic side of it, as that a lot of the models that I was encountering did not speak English, and much less, a lot of them didn't really have a lot of experience in working in big Western cities, because you have to imagine too, a lot of them were coming from favelas in Rio, and this was their first international travel, and this is New York City. And it just brought a lot of ideas to mind, because like even just with different topics such as just like building relationships and feeling comfortable, and we'll get into this idea of dignity later when I get into the social services. It really went a long way just to be able to communicate with these models in their language of choice. So, back then in the job market, I think a lot of kind of jobs were looking for people that spoke Spanish and like French, and like those kind of languages were seen as a hot commodity. But when I worked in a modeling agency speaking Portuguese or Russian, and later in the career when China really started to blow up, being able to speak Chinese was seen as a real big commodity, because you could speak with these talents that were coming from these international countries on a more personal level, and then you could also speak with their agents and family who were also from these countries, who a lot of the times if the children didn't speak English, they wouldn't speak English as they wouldn't speak English either. So that, I can't go too much into that. Casting director in China. So this is a little bit later in my career. I actually moved to China to work as a casting director. And basically how that worked is I had a big Rolodex of clients from working with new faces in New York. Previous, when I went to school, the first time I was in Hunter, I was a Chinese major. And so I was put a lot of, in touch with a lot of like Asian adjacent clients. I worked a lot with Japanese clients, Korean clients, Chinese clients. And just living in China, so basically I say all that to say, these clients this is when China started to have a really big boom with the luxury markets. So a lot of fashion shows would go into Asia to do shows, so like Dior and Prada and all the shows would go there. And they would pay me because I knew what kind of models the market was looking for and had the experience with working in Asia. And I think that was a really interesting point to me because I feel China is notoriously difficult for, if you don't speak Chinese and kind of communicating with people there, it's really hard. But because I come from like kind of this privileged position of being in a place of power, I felt like it was a totally different experience and that people really just went out of their ways to really kind of make me feel comfortable and to try to really take an effort to speak the language. And I think looking at that on a micro level, what it really comes down to is just how much of a commodity language is, because this wasn't something that they would have done had I been someone else that wasn't coming with something that was, seen as value to them. And a lot of the times it wasn't like interns or assistants who spoke English, it was like the main managers because they were the ones that were speaking with international clients. So for them to come out with the client obviously takes a lot more than for someone to send an assistant. So these are just different things that language can, obviously I could go into these for much longer, but those are some ideas. And I think, working now at a shelter, which in some, sense of the word could be seen as like totally an opposite engagement, also shares a lot of those same observations that I see there. So with the shelter system, Professor Lee pointed out earlier, language can serve as a lifeline in spaces where one's identity, dignity, and humanity are at stake. And I think that's not illustrated in any place more profoundly than in the shelter, where a lot of people, specifically in the family shelter, which is where I work, but a lot of people are dealing with a lot of different serious matters that don't just, range from not having a place to stay. There's a lot of food insecurity. It's also just a matter of dignity with being able to put your best self forward while maybe feeling like you're in one of the lowest places of your life. And I think with that kind of perspective on it, we can then see how far language goes and being able to really bridge that gap, or being able to kind of make things a lot more comfortable for people that are already living in, situations that might not be best for them. But, language holds a big part. Institutional communication, obviously, to get things done, you gotta be able to speak. And one issue which I'll tie into my research, which really is around machine translation, that we're finding, I'm sure any of you that might be working in social services, adjacent fields or anything, are seeing that a lot of people are requesting translators. And I think there's not enough translators, especially for Spanish speakers. And I think there's a kind of disconnect, like this was something I put up here, but like even when you have this idea of a translator, it's not simply just saying one word, moving one word to another. It's really about trying to fulfill an objective or to prove a point or to, do a goal. And I think a lot of times when you put people, like, I'll give you an example. A lot of the times when I'm at the shelter, a lot of the people we're dealing with are from Venezuela. So a lot of them speak English, a lot of them speak Spanish. A lot of the people that work at the shelter are African American and don't speak Spanish. So one issue that we have is that we have to employ the usage of language line, which basically is this off-center, it's how do you call it, like third-party individual that comes on and translates for you as you speak to them, like a one-on-one translation. The problem with this is obviously these aren't social workers, these aren't doctors, these aren't people, these aren't lawyers, so they don't really understand the nuance of a word. And I think one of the biggest things we're learning about translation is really this idea of the semantics and getting the meaning across. That ties in, because I know I could be a little bit long-winded, but that ties into my research because what I've been really trying to look into is this idea of nuance and meaning and seeing if that is really kind of kept or if it's lost when you apply it to machine translation, which is where a lot of things are moving because we don't have the manpower to kind of pick up the slack when translation is needed. And I think just to the point that I made previously about being able to not really grasp the nuance if you're not particularly aligned with a certain job, I think we can only imagine how much harder it is for something that's not even human to do the same thing. And some ideas, and just to kind of bring up, like I touched on shelter, but just to kind of think of like future issues, with machine translation, I always think of things like language and data access as opposed to social systems, access speed. I think these are all really good things with just making things move easier, and just kind of increasing comfortability with certain things that happen on a day-to-day. But I think these are really surface level things that people need to consider a little more deeply if they want to really ascertain if this would be a good idea for the future. Because I'd also like to bring up ideas such as intellectual property, language, and when you use AI systems, and you can, not to say that I use AI systems, but obviously we do a research on it, you play around with it, and I think it's really scary if you have this thing that can, take someone's lifetime work and really just kind of put it down into like a little code and then apply that to other words and just be able to reproduce that. Even though it might not be the same as if the person wrote it, I think to the level that it can reproduce something probably exceeds that of a human. And I think in that way you start to infringe on what this idea of like owning that in the intellectual property. I think that's something. Discrimination, also in my research I found that artificial intelligence can also identify who's using it based on the language and the syntax and those topics. And I think a lot of the time too that raises ideas of what the AI can tell who we are, who's in charge of the AI, and how does it treat people differently based on that. And also AI hallucinations, which is just this idea of getting truthful knowledge or just knowledge from AI under the guise of being truthful but actually it not being what it seems. And I think just the more that we implement AI and large language models in our day-to-day life, these small things that might be kind of insignificant now can really magnify and come to a place later that we start to see systems really mirrored in AI that we really are actively trying to work against today in ourselves. So yeah, that's kind of the stuff that I have going on to talk about. Thank you.
If there are any pressing questions or comments now, we can take a few. Also, those of you online, if you have any, there's a hand.
Do you think that we could somehow train an AI model specifically for translation for those who are in dire situations like in need of housing or in any way to help express what they're going through?
I think so. I think there's ways that we could work toward that future, but just to bring up one issue that I've considered a lot as well, is that in a lot of these marginalized communities, AI is trained up on information that exists already. So, one thing that Professor Moody and I were discussing with this discourse is that all of this kind of language speak is still only written. So a lot of the, and this brings up issues of like standardized English and like lesser spoken kind of dialects and things like that. Typically the most marginalized don't have that breadth of kind of written language and literature to really train up a model like this one. So I kind of feel like in my kind of point of this disenfranchisement being kind of precipitated due to this, these AI systems and things that we really have issues with in reality is evident in the work that we feed to the AI. So I think it's kind of silly for us not to think that a lot of these same things that we have in our heads and quirks and problems wouldn't be kind of put into the system. So I think from that to your point about the marginalized systems and the translations, I think it's definitely a noble effort and something we should work towards, but I think we should put a lot of consideration into a lot of the things that go into it before we really depend on it as like a musical service.
I was wondering how the languages spoke.
So I'm like a busybody. So I've taken so many languages, but like one of my kind of goals in returning to school now is to kind of like really take that study further. But I've taken like everything. When I went to high school, for science in New York. So I took Greek, French, Spanish, Chinese, Japanese. I've taken Swahili. So I've taken like a breadth of classes. I've also like, when I was in China, I was like in all kinds of programs there, still trying to, but again, I was like, the job I had was pretty intense. And it was a lot going on, so kind of to me, it was like, I need to make this bag, I get the language, and I'm not going to my life. I need the money, so.
I guess my question is more like in comparison to like with machine translation, do you find that people who are able to, you know, like you said, the translators who maybe don't get the full nuance but are able to you know, translate between languages, do you find that they're able to get to like you said, where like they're able to explain it more like better than maybe a machine translation, even though maybe the machine might have like a specific word?
I think there's still something very like, I think there's another level to language that we're not really kind of tapping into yet, that's a lot more than just like A, B, B, C, C, D, D. And I feel like, you know, I think even someone like, my Spanish isn't amazing, but I found definitely just being able to kind of kiki with some of the clients at the agency, at the shelter a little bit. Even when I was younger and like fresh out of school and like being in China and speaking with the models, and I mean, even, you know, if I could just be direct, being black and in China and speaking Chinese, they were all like gagged. So like even with having maybe like 5% of the skill that a computer would have, just the effect that being a person, being able to relate and being able to have this kind of rapport, I think did so much, you know, benefit toward the goal of, you know, whether it's helping make someone more comfortable or helping them solve a problem. I think there's a thing about that human to human interaction that can't be duplicated by a machine.
Do you think that we should focus on like one type of translation over another, or do you think that they're both useful, like depending on the situation, like machine versus human translation?
I think there's pros and cons to everything. You know, I think even if it was to say that like music is a language, you know, math is a language, and I don't really see it so much that humans are going to really be able to compete with AI in that regard. You know what I'm saying? Even if the translation, because I think even on a really small, micro level, the translation, the way that works, I don't think is the same way we work. I wish I want to go down some conspiracy, you know. But I think there's still benefits in that, even if the application of it is for something else in the future.
So when I was younger, I worked for this Spanish shoe store, and so for some reason I became very good at speaking about leathers and shoes and sustainability in Spanish, but that's all I could say at that time. So with like the variety of language that you have and like your schools of experiences, have you found that you're particularly good at speaking about a certain realm in the language and not so much like maybe the basic stuff like readings, like, but you're so good at speaking about models or like casting?
Actually, I feel like my experience is that I think it's actually really, like, I don't think learning languages in schools is so helpful.
Yeah.
I feel like I've taken a lot of classes, and I don't really feel as though my language level is where it should be for the amount of work I put in. And that's why I think my trip and stint living in China wasn't effective, because like, despite being in classes, because I had the clients kind of like coddling me so much, was like, oh no, we can speak English, I never really got that like need to really like, oh my god, how do you say and I never really pushed it further. So I'm not the most impressed, but I think definitely that was my reason for it, despite my school.
name is Mandy Francois. I'm a linguistics student. And I'm also a bit of a storyteller, so it's kind of going to be the modality for this presentation. I'll be reading some of my notes here while also just walking you through what's projected. So, everyone hopes to be understood in moments of extreme pain, but our life trajectories are often at the mercy of how we are interpreted by the institutions that we inhabit. My presentation, As Serious as Your Life, explores a moment where I saw a breakdown in linguistic connection reshape a human life. Necessary crying video. We're gonna play it, y'all. In November 2022, I was fighting a bureaucratic system at City Tech that refused to recognize my residency because my name wasn't written on any lease, I had no state ID, and no bank statements with the New York State address. I couldn't afford the out-of-state tuition, so I was forced to drop out. That's when I took on this job as a medical interpreter remotely for Haitian Creole patients. And that very first picture is kind of me confronting to my mom that I would have to leave school because I couldn't afford it. The other photos are kind of my experience as a medical interpreter working remotely when all I wanted to do was be a student. Number 3 is kind of my response to really seeing how necessary this job was for my livelihood. Kind of empathizing with patients with how they felt in response to providers not responding to their needs as well. Again, necessary crying video. I was signed on to a session for a woman in a psychiatric unit held through suicidal attempts. The previous interpreter reported that she said she wanted to stab herself, but she wasn't. What she was describing was intense C-section pains, but instead she was met with misunderstanding and sent to a mental health unit and separated from her family. This interpretation system practices referential transparency, which is when people treat your words as simple labels and pathologize your cultural identity. Can words really just be plugged in without losing meaning? Are these the systems that we exist in? There's a big problem with word-for-word logic, which I love that Tracy touched on as well. Many medical systems and social working systems rely on the idea of referential transparency, which assumes that words are just simple labels that can be stripped from the speaker and just moved into another language without losing its true meaning. The things that get lost. This approach completely ignores the paralinguistic features of tone, the facial expressions, all the signals that Haitian Creole speakers use to express the severity of their experiences. This is something that's evident, it seems almost too obvious. We use certain tones, certain expressions, our faces change when we're expressing certain things, and we kind of assume that people understand this. But with a language like Haitian Creole, when the lady was describing some stabbing pains, I believe that a lot of these things were ignored, and instead, the words that she used to express herself were just used literally, which caused her to be separated from her family and locked in a place where she did not belong. There's a power dynamic at play here. As I believe there's a power dynamic at play in every single interaction that uses language, period. Here, when interpreters overlook those features, those paralinguistic features, your tone, the tone of your voice, the expressions of your face, the inflection you use, when those things are overlooked, the communication style of the American English-speaking clinician becomes the unmarked standard, and anything that doesn't fit, like the somatic metaphor for pain, can be viewed as a psychiatric emergency, as I did with this lady in 2023. So what does it mean to take on a racialized position and reject verbatim interpretation? For me, I think that everything is racial. And I think as an interpreter, you need to assume that role is also racialized. We all have our schools of experiences, we all have our own moral compasses, and we all have these things that we believe in. So to demand for an invisible, neutral bridge of an interpreter is a lie. And I think it's an injustice to everyone it serves. So the demand for an invisible interpreter assumes that language can be separated from a speaker's body and history. In reality, the interpreter is a social actor whose own racial and cultural position is central to the conversation. So I wonder what the interpreter before me, how they were informed, and you know what their beliefs, how their beliefs informs the way that they reacted to this lady's expression of pain. What did they think was appropriate to do? Was it appropriate to interject? Was it not appropriate to interject in that context? Did it serve the clinician more if she just said everything that the lady said smoothly? Or would this be an appropriate moment to kind of interject, hey, this is actually an patient field expression. She is not trying to hurt herself. This screenshot paints a picture of what many interpreters face. These are shared views from a clinical team in a 2022 study on the roles of medical interpreters in the NICU. Reading some of these medical professionals' sentiments on interpretation, you can see why some interpreters feel that not interjecting beyond verbatim interpretation is the expectation. This slide kind of really touches on a belief that I have that language is linked to power and control, which Dr. Moody also touched on in her slides. You see some of these where doctors say, when interpreters adapt the interpretation, I try to clarify to them by saying, it's okay to just translate exactly what the patient is saying, rather than adding something from their own perspective, which taints things in terms of what the patient or their family might be wanting to say. This physician says that most of their in-person interpreters do a good job at that. Someone else says, the translator might be automatically simplifying, or the translator might automatically be convincing what they say into medical ease. And I don't know how much the translator is altering the sophistication of the patient's language. So these physicians here prefer the module where it's verbatim interpretation, where things are just said in real time as they're said, without any interjections, without any back and forth with person A being the patient, person B being the interpreter, and person C being the clinician. They don't want any of that. Wait, what did you mean by that? Wait, did you mean it by this expression? They don't want any of that. That is automatically translated as perhaps they're simplifying or adding their own jargon to the language. To conclude, I return to the theme of this exposition, which is to find a common thread. My trajectory from the frustration of Bursar's office to the intensity of an interpretation session taught me that language is the ultimate gatekeeper of our life experiences. The woman in that unit and I have both been at the mercy of an institution's willingness to listen and to understand. So whether it's a student fighting to stay in school, or a patient fighting to prove sanity and reunite with their family, the stakes are the same. I think all language users should overcome neutrality with one another, because being understood is always as serious as your life. Thank you.
But thank you so much. I really did appreciate it.
Given that this was a pretty egregious example of, I would say that this is incompetency at this point. Do you have any thoughts and or ideas for how this kind of situation be prevented? And in terms of, since you also mentioned putting away neutrality, do you have any ideas of what that would look like in terms of interpreter training or hiring requirements or whatnot?
Yeah, I think there are several modules for interpreters, and one of them, the one that I'm very against, is the verbatim interpretation module, which is something that a lot of clinicians favor because when something is verbatim, then it's clear. And in the medical realm, you don't want anything to be unclear. You don't want there to be any middle spaces. But the truth is, languages, there's always going to be things in the middle. There's always going to be things that completely change the message. And so I think to move forward and avoid situations like this and really honor patients, honor providers, and just honor families in general, we should ensure that there is sort of a discursive competency when it comes to being qualified to interpret, because being fluent in a language does not necessarily mean, even just being very fluent at the medical terminology of the language does not mean that you're able to sense like sarcasm in that language, that you're able to sense certain expressions, that you're able to tell a lie in that language. So that's one thing. And the other thing, I think it's a very Western thought that you have to be clear and transparent and say things as they are. One of my favorite writers, his name is Edward Glissant, and he talks about in Poetics of Consciousness this idea of opacity. And the West kind of encourages transparency. It says that things should be easy to receive, easy to understand, so that every party can be understood. But what Edward Glissant says is in opacity, you have the right to have nuance. You have the right for things to not be so clear, but it's still professional. So I think besides what I mentioned earlier on the cultural discursive competency, also it should be fine that in interpretation sessions, you don't just go word by word, but you're able to interject and kind of be a cultural anchor in the presence of the patient and provider. That was a long answer.
This is more of a comment than a question, but I want to say, like the way that you like really describe like medical linguistic racism is so clear and just like anyone who's like ever struggled to express themselves, and advocate for themselves, when they're in hospitals or anywhere where you're helping really to really, feel this, and this, and then this you highlight one of the key parts of a big reservoir in healthcare spaces, not only for all kinds of work, and and I think that the example that you brought up, is a great example of how also Black women tend to not be listened to when describing their pain, right? It's taken, like you said, it's taken out of context and not given the full nuance, and then because of how reactionary a lot of these medical systems can be, immediately she's taken family. And, you know, I read so much of your work regarding like imperial and medicine, and I feel like this is like amazing work, and I absolutely love you to present. And thank you for being so vulnerable with us about your own experiences as well.
Right. Thank you for your very thoughtful comments, feedback, questions, encouragement. I now have a few questions that are not just to the panelists, but it's to all of us to think with and through kind of in a more collective sense. So I want to discuss that. So I think what we've seen today is a beautiful example of how you can incorporate your research interests and your lived experience in academia. But as I said earlier, I want this to be a way for all of us to engage in dialogue about the role of language in our lives. We're all different, but we are interconnected. And we see ways that language can unite, as well as how language can exclude, divide, dehumanize. And we just have some questions for you all in terms of how do you see yourself in relation to the languages you speak? How do these languages tie into your identity? Don't want to answer that, you're welcome to. Some of the others.
Wait, I was going to answer.
In,
So the last two I was going to answer. So what is like the deal with like graduating from grad school origin? I feel like I do a lot of for my research project. I'm doing a lot of research in queer identities, world queer identities. And one thing I noticed a lot is there's a lot of code switching between queer identities, depending on whether they come to a male or a female, and other body facts and their body language especially. Something I noticed myself from a little area. And you judge people by their accent. I would say I feel like I judge people. I'm from Northwestern Georgia, so the South. And I've noticed it's like after moving to New York City, I sometimes think about being a train. I'll hear someone visiting like me, and I'll hear Japanese someone accent, and I will judge them. I feel like all my life, and me specifically, like I kind of, especially in like this kind of suburban area I kind of grew up in a sense, I kind of was told that having an accent, a deep accent, is really wrong. And I feel like it's just seen as improper, especially in academic world.
I received those same messages generations or two earlier when I was going to rural Southeast. Thank you for that.
Specifically, when it comes to, I found the ordinance review part of that question really interesting because one thing that I've just since Matthew brought up like neutrality is that if you speak one of the perceived dialects, you get the privilege of people ignoring the language that you use in order to focus on the meaning. So, but if you speak any marked variation of the language, no matter what you do, that is something that people will pick up on. Like whether it's it's accent that marks where you're from originally, or intonation patterns that reveal aspects of maybe your sexuality, gender, whatever, and it's sort of interesting to think that because it's invisible, it allows you to communicate with less much learning compared to other people that have to overcome these preconceptions that listeners will have based solely on their word usage and pronunciation.
And your example made me think about one that I mentioned in classes previously. So that someone speaking a marked variety or variety that differs from that standardized and visible norm, sometimes it's even one pronunciation of one single word. They will focus in on that and miss the whole meaning of everything. I recall a student, a high school student, who she was in a debate and she did an excellent job. Pronunciation of ass was pronounced ass. And one of the moderators said, oh, I couldn't understand. I didn't take anything away from what she said because of how she pronounced that. So it is very much the case. And you see also definitely the connection between language use, power, control, access, privilege, all the things that we
Also, it's somewhat attest to that experience because my mom's from the Dominican Republic and my dad is from Argentina. So while they speak at the end of the day, they speak the same language. They speak extremely different varieties of the same language. So because I have been exposed to both varieties very extensively, my accent is very mixed. I have lots of traits of Argentinian vocabulary, some accent, Dominican vocabulary, maybe slightly more Dominican, but simply just visiting my Argentinian family and just someone asking me, how is the city? And I say, it's cool. I say, it's chévere. That one single word people immediately notice that I come from Argentina. And I think that that's just to say, like, I think the best thing that one can do is just, like, embrace your idiolect, embrace your variety of the language, because no one can take that from you. But your language is yours. Even my father, like, will sometimes correct me in ways that I'm just thinking, you don't know exactly what I'm saying. Like, sometimes I feel like this corrections can be redundant, so yeah, just, like, when you're learning a language, don't focus on the perceived dialect, just appreciate your dialect and your feelings.
I want to say something about the second question. So, like, I read something from class that I think put it really well. Basically, it said that teachers demand like children have speaking of like standardized like way of English in America because their employers are in it. And I think that really is a great way of putting how language is involved in this like power dynamic of like class and race, because they demand, like a middle class white and way of speaking because that is what what they have to look for in order to get paid. And so like, and if they don't teach that, then it sends to it's just like it says like you didn't teach your children properly, and a lot of it is always racialized, always targeted, especially towards black children or just and any children who grow up and speaking English as well. And I think in a lot of studies where it's very involved with like where it's very involved with people or heavily involved, we always have to know question who are the people who are able to tell the story. You know, who's the one who controls what the language is. You know, in history, who's the one telling the story. In film, who is given the power to use the camera and create their own story. And I think that's these are questions you have to think about when thinking about how people use their language and specifically like why you choose not to listen to certain kinds of people or choose to listen to certain people. So.
I don't know. One thing that's been on my mind, or one anecdote that I can share, which is also, I think, another perspective interesting to language. As I mentioned earlier, and a lot of people at the shelter that I work at are Venezuelan. And a lot of people that work there are Black, that don't speak Spanish. And I think there's always like, whenever there's like a miscommunication, there's always like, this tendency, because I can understand it a little, that it's always like a immediate, you think you're better than us because you speak English to us. And I think this, not to even speak on, because I think there's also something interesting, even the fact that these are two demographics that I think when you don't speak the language and you just go off the actions, you can see how things can be escalated. So I think that's also something interesting to talk about. But I think this idea of power, and the first thing you go to when it's a fight is the language, which obviously you're in a different country, but I still think, considering all things, to me, I think that would kind of seem maybe like more insignificant on the scale if it wasn't, you know what I'm saying? So I think that's always an interesting thing. And even just to the effect that I can, communicate on a basic level to this idea of dignity as well, and just feeling like you're being heard, and like, and I think just because I think when you're in a compromised place, things like that matter even more, even though you would maybe think it would be the opposite, you know what I'm saying? I think, so, I don't know, I think language really does have a lot of power, and I feel like with more, technological advancements that we're making across the board, and even just with like research into psychological processes and just like how philosophical ideas are kind of aiming, I think this is a lot to be said to the point that language isn't just, I think there's a lot more depth and significance to it.
Yeah, I think it's true that language in general, it reveals the ideas that you reject and the ones that you accept. And I think one of the more scary things about it is that it also reveals who, like the dominant figures in your lives, what ideas they accept, reject, or question. So yeah, that's why I use the term like that. It's a very racialized experience to use language, and we shouldn't just treat it as a neutral case.
I like how you use the word racialized experience. I really like that. Also, I want to. Can you elaborate on what you meant by like being scared, kind of in a way? When you use the word scared, can you elaborate a bit more on what you meant by that?
When I just said that it's scary that the dominant figures in our lives also have those ideas.
Sorry, I'm trying to do that. The ideas being
Scared?
I'm trying to say it's like I feel like we should be scared of the language and how we speak in our dialects. I feel like we should all really be proud of the language we have, and we shouldn't. We shouldn't be afraid to like like even to tell like translators like, hey, you're doing this wrong. You are, and you're deliberately doing this wrong. Like whenever you're describing the like college, like a medical field, it's very strict and a straight interpretation. I feel like I felt a little bit that was like racially rooted and how and like general American speaking. And it's like I think a major thing that needs to happen is we say no, not everyone in this country speaks directly with just their words. They speak with their actions and how they express themselves as well. I think we kind of needed like. I think saying we're scared is wrong. We should. I feel like I'm thinking like having someone having a sword drawn. It's like we should really start. We should fight back against this kind of idea.
I agree. I think it's something that can be empowering more than just like letting ourselves feel scared about that. I think I use that term because when you're in a medical setting, you are putting so much trust in your physicians to do the right thing and to have right intentions about you, and it is a scary thought that they are also being informed by their own beliefs that maybe they don't reveal by telling you, hey, I already think you're crazy because you're an immigrant and this is your first doctor checkup and you were pregnant the entire way from Mexico to Iowa. So, like maybe they won't say that, but all of those things are there and you don't really want to. You're hoping that your provider doesn't have these assumptions about you, but in the way that they react to your language or your situations, it's revealed.
Personally, I think fear and being scared is appropriate. I mean, wouldn't it be so lovely if we could all just be exactly who we want to be and not be judged by it for it? But I mean, that's not the world we live in. I think, with matters of health, matters of freedom, matters of, just kind of well-being. I think a lot of people hold a lot of power, and I don't necessarily think that, a lot of people that are kind of dependent on this power most necessarily really have a stake in their autonomy or their well-being when it comes to this. So, I would be scared, you know what I'm saying? So I think, and I get the idea, the intention is noble, but fantasy and reality are two different things. So.
Okay, since you specifically about fantasy and reality, I'm just curious after hearing a Mandy's story and also reflecting against my mother's story, she works as a school nurse at a bilingual public school. And what's interesting is that her Spanish is at the point where she can understand what people say, but she has a hard time speaking. So she calls interpreters just because she does not want to be misunderstood. But many times she'll actually realize that the interpreter is literally misinterpreting her, and then she will go on and say, I didn't say that. Or sometimes both her and the kid that she's talking to will both realize that and also say, hey, I didn't say that. So and given that, two data points, but I'm assuming that this happens unfortunately too often. So I'm just curious, I wonder why these issues come up and whether it has to be whether it has to be the hiring process, just inherent difficulties of interpreting over the phone with audio quality and lack of facial features. I'm curious what you guys think about this unfortunately recurring pattern.
I think the second you add even a phone or tech, there's an extra layer between the speaker, the two speaking. Conversation and communication is already so complicated and so many things are already missed, even if you turn the other way or you're not giving someone your gaze, that even adding this extra layer, it makes it more complicated. That's that. But I think it would be helpful to just acknowledge that it is a messy, not clean thing to add an interpreter and it does complicate things, rather than treating interpretation as the thing that will solve this problem that the patient doesn't speak the language. So I'm not sure that there is a way to make interpretation perfect or something that will not cause issues or determine someone's life. But I really, really hope that it can be pushed that even in very sterile and just controlled environments like medical settings, it's that the minute you add someone else to this, it complicates things and just has a preface. I think that would be a necessary preface. That's good.
Yeah, I don't think it's that 100%. I mean, sometimes you just get a nasty person. You know that's just going to be difficult no matter how you do it, no matter how. Sometimes you got to deal with people that are drunk that, despite their best intentions and everyone really trying to listen, they just can't really articulate themselves in the way that they need to. I think it's more kind of like a quality control thing that it's necessary to be mindful and to stay abreast of what's going on with it, because it is something very important, even if it's not to the point that you'll be able to fix it effectively 100%. But I think it working at 85% is better than 50. You know what I'm saying? Even though that's not the best, that's not the goal, but I mean, ideally it would be 100,
Things that came up in the questions, try to maybe pull some things and synthesize some things and reflect on my own teaching and research experiences. But one, I guess, has to do with the reason why someone might be scared, why someone might not advocate for themselves. And in my experience, both here in the United States and in the Netherlands, where I taught for 7 years, I had students time and time again coming to me saying that they felt they had to police themselves in the classroom, in the broader society. They had to police the way they dress, their hair, the texture of their hair, how they spoke, their body language. Because oftentimes what others might be able to get away with and it's seen as being assertive, someone else is being viewed as aggressive, or they're being stereotyped or characterized as this angry black woman, black man. So sometimes people are afraid to speak up. Sometimes they don't even know they have the right to challenge an interpreter, or they may not have the linguistic ability. Sometimes you know that someone is not translating something right, but your language is not proficient enough to really advocate for yourself. So you can sometimes say, okay, or try to repeat or reiterate, but oftentimes an interpreter will just ignore that. They'll say, okay, this person's just repeating the same thing, but the person is making an attempt to try to say, no, I want to hear me, but they don't have the words, to do so. But it is something to think about, and I don't know if any of you have had an experience, either here on the college campus or anywhere, that you felt you had to police yourself in some ways. People describe it as a term referred to as racial code switching that people have to do. And it's not just linguistic, it's a number of things that we do in order to make ourselves more palatable to the dominant society. And sometimes there are intersections. I mean, someone mentions some intersections of social class and race and things. So those things are relevant, and they do impact how we respond in certain situations. We have about 5 minutes. I see one more hand. So far, no one online.
I have two things to say. First, to touch on the question. I think it was 1 or 2 nights ago that I helped someone out with a Spanish presentation where she was interviewing me in Spanish and recording the conversation to show to her classmates, to use this in a project. And I noticed that while I was answering the interview questions, my language was really, really different from how I would speak naturally. Because at first I was thinking I just wanted to speak slower and enunciate, that's it. But then I realized every single time I made a tiny mistake, I immediately recognized it. I said, oh no, we have to retake it. We have to retake it. This is wrong. Like, it's like the prescriptivism, like, really, really got to me. I think that's like, it's like a problem. Like classroom settings where like the language is like policed in a way. For example, my dad is Spanish professor, and he also has this like tendency to like police language in a way, and like what's right or what's wrong. He doesn't mean harm by it, and I know most teachers, of course, don't mean harm by it, but I feel like it should be like other accents and variety should be like incorporated. I also wanted to touch on the language thing about being scared of like authority figures in language. I agree with y'all because I was thinking about the intersection between like language and government, where like it's like the government does have like a say in what language is used, what language feels like the right thing to do, whether it be like mass media or like the U.S. government speaking Spanish or government website. Or I was also thinking about China, where Mandarin is the standard language, like the prestige dialect is based on one city's language and dialect, and then every other language in the country is referred to as a dialect, even though linguistically speaking they're fully fledged languages, and also that's caused like the linguistic like diversity of China going down. So I think it is very fair to like be scared of the authority figures of language because they're very powerful.
I have finally someone online. Feel free to unmute yourself. I will call out your name because you're on HSS.
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So yes, I just wanted to comment on the second question. How does language link to terrorism? So I guess it's very much linked because you know we're at this point in human history where we're close to the nuclear war, then we're going to full-blown world war for the third time. And I think language in war propaganda should be something to watch out for, because as we all know, our media outlets are owned by whoever our overlords are, and they use emotionally charged language, euphemism, in order to promote an agenda to dehumanize the quote-unquote enemy and justify violence. So yeah, I just thought of that and saw the second question.
Thank you for that. In my course, we also talk about propaganda and persuasion. I'll have the final comment here, and we will close it out.
Sorry, it's just a quick thing. What you were talking about earlier was reminding me of that one essay, which I'm sure if you're a linguistics major, you probably read it at some point. But I think it was Jonathan McCloskey and Nelson Flores, unless I'm mixing up their names, but they were basically talking about how I'm doing proteins, yeah. And they were talking about how basically if you're non-white, then even if you make every attempt you can to speak the most quote-unquote perfect English you can, like, you will always be viewed through this like racialized lens by the white listening speaker. And I think about that so much because like what do you even do in that situation? It just obviously it's never your responsibility, or I don't think it should be your responsibility like somebody who's not white to appeal to a white audience. But like I don't know, I feel like obviously people have this feeling where they have to repress certain parts of themselves to, appeal to that. But even if you do that successfully, like you're never actually going to be successful.
So that is all we have time for. I want to thank all of you who attended. Make sure that you found in unit 2. If your instructor has any questions, you can direct them to me. You came. For my students, I have all of you are present. Those of you online, I also have you. So again, I guess that's about all we have. So